Двери, двери, премудростью вон мемон.
Good evening from Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca. A couple of subjects we want to discuss this evening, and since we're going to try to limit the broadcast to 10 to 15 minutes each, we'll likely do this in two sessions, or with an intermission in between, as we try to improve the quality of the broadcasting and the studio itself. One of the first things I wanted to discuss this evening, something I'd read in a medical journal, and then I came across it in our ResearchGate association, which was online among people involved in various sciences. Today it appeared in the Toronto Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, and that is revealing the fetal genome. That is, looking at the genome of a child in the womb. Now, in previous times, this involved inserting a needle in to the womb itself and drawing amniotic fluid from it, which had certain dangers. Now, however, taking a sample of blood from the mother and a mouth sample of mouth fluids or spittle from the father can allow doctors to get a fairly complete genome. And with that method, they can look for birth defects of various kinds, in particular things like cystic fibrosis and other genetic illnesses. Now let's remember, of course, that the gene itself is not what's causing an illness. There's either a malfunctioning gene or a gene which is not switched on by an epigenetic switch. But even at that, the gene does not directly immediately cause the illness. It causes an illness by not producing something that is necessary or overproducing something, and this sets off a cascade of effects that can create birth defects of various kinds. So here's the danger in this new system. It can predict with a very reasonable accuracy, a very close accuracy, a birth defect in a child early on in the womb. It's not 100% certain, but what it does is open a new avenue for deciding on abortions above all. A child who's going to have certain birth defects, or who has a very good chance of having certain birth defects, people would tend to abort the child. Some people would use the information, at least a few, to look for possible therapies and ways to deal with that kind of a birth defect. But I believe that by far the majority would opt for an abortion in those cases. Now, the fact that this is not 100% certain leaves some ethical questions open. For many religious people, of course, it leaves a number of both religious and ethical questions open. But I thought I would invite attention to it. It's fascinating that the genome can be sequenced from a given human being through the blood of the mother and a gene sample taken from the mouth of the father, and that we can get that clear and that larger picture of the fetus before it's born. So before long, other situations that affect birth, that affect the child after birth, are going to be able to be determined while the child is still in the womb and early on in the fetal stage. Now that will allow not only for a greater understanding of humans and of infants and early childhood, it may very well make a lot of therapies possible to cure some of these things or avoid them in the early fetal stage. I believe that eventually will be possible. There is already a hybridizing process that's used in the possible cystic fibrosis cases where the certain kinds of cystic fibrosis can be engineered out of the genes before pregnancy is even achieved. And I wouldn't go into how that's done, we might deal with it a little later, but anyway, genetic engineering is a thing of our present, and it's used to deal with any number of birth defects or possible birth defects. The one thing to watch out for this particular process of the fetal genome is the fact that it could radically increase the number of abortions, some of which would have been for fetuses that would not have had a given birth defect, and others for a birth defect that can be dealt with after the child is born, but parents may very well opt for an abortion. So this is one of the dangers in this process. The positive side, of course, is that it's possible then to search for ways to intervene, to do some genetic engineering, to avoid some of the more serious birth illnesses. I don't think we should perhaps call them birth defects. I don't think that one should call cystic fibrosis, retinoblastoma, any of these things, or even Down syndrome. I'm not sure we should call it a birth defect, but some of them are genetic illnesses that will affect the child sometimes all of their life and sometimes shorten their lives. So these are things to think about in this particular process because you're bound to hear about it, and many of you will eventually have this offer during a pregnancy to assess the genome of the fetus and look for any kind of genetic illnesses or other possible reasons why some doctors might recommend even an abortion. And why you, on the other hand, if you're not going to opt for that, you could then look at ways, what kind of therapies are available, what kind of treatments, and how to cope with this kind of a childhood disease or a genetic disease or genetic illness that a child might be born with. That's one of the interesting items that we wanted to cover today, and I think we'll deal with a couple of more in a second broadcast that we'll put online a little later. Thank you for joining us here at CanadianOrthodoxBroadcasting.ca. We welcome your suggestions, your advice, and your criticisms.